The imperial coronation of Charlemagne in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800 was a fitting climax to the achievements of the greatest of medieval kings. His name comes from the Latin Carolus Magnus, or Charles the Great, and there can be no doubt about his claim to greatness. Because at the end of the 8th century, he managed to create, for a short time at least, a united Europe, something that military leaders and politicians have been trying to do ever since. Charlemagne founded the Holy Roman Empire, which came to be one of the greatest forces in history, uniting many parts of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Central Europe. In spite of its name, this empire he created didn't have very much to do with the old Roman Empire. What was important about it, though, was that with its foundation, Charlemagne brought an order and political stability to Europe that had not been seen since the end of the Roman Empire.
I think what makes him such a significant character is that he is really the connector between the Roman world, the far distant past in history, and the modern world. And without Charlemagne, in a way, we'd have a massive gap between those two worlds, between antiquity and the modern world as we know it. So many things about the world around us that we know now could not be there if it hadn't been for Charlemagne. Our language, the nature and the shape of Europe. I mean, the very fact that we talk about areas of France, areas like Italy, the way they're ruled, these are all laying down in the Carolingian period.
Charlemagne was the greatest leader of his age. He ruled for 46 years, from the year 768 until 814, and from the first until the last year of his reign, he was at war. His reign was taken up by one military campaign after another, as he extended the borders of his lands from a fairly small kingdom in the Meuse-Moselle region on the borders of modern France, Germany, Belgium, and Holland, to a great empire which stretched from the river Elbe to the river Ebro. And from the North Sea to Rome, uniting in one superstate, practically all the lands of Western Europe. He was always on the move, and at a time when there were no proper roads, the distances he covered were huge. 2,000 kilometers on foot and on horseback from one end of his lands to the other, through forest and marshland and across great rivers and mountain ranges.
He was an extremely successful early medieval ruler. I mean, he was a conqueror. He expanded the territory under his control considerably. I mean, he more than doubled the amount of territory that he inherited from his father.
To understand the story of Charlemagne and his achievements, we have to see how his will to extend his power and govern were inseparably linked with his mission to spread the Christian religion. He thought he was personally responsible for the progress of God's kingdom on earth. Every people and every tribe he subdued had to take an oath of allegiance and had to convert to the Christian religion. But in the midst of almost continuous war, he created centers of learning where the arts of peace, building, manuscript copying, bookbinding, and gold and silversmiths' work were able to flourish. Charlemagne legislated for agriculture, industry, finance, education, and religion, as well as for government and morals. But above all, he was a warrior, whose military success was built on good leadership and strong administration. His achievements were so great that they inspired a succession of military conquerors and would-be unifiers of Europe right up to the present day, earning him the title Father of Europe.
Charlemagne had a huge impact upon both the rule of Europe and later what we might describe as megalomaniacs. Anyone who came later who thought, I'd like to be an emperor of Europe, they tend to model themselves on previous architects of an imperial Europe. Charlemagne became a great figure for you to look back on and say, I'm like Charlemagne, I'll model myself on him.
Having acquired more territory than any other European monarch of his times, he was able to keep control of it because he understood that the various people he had brought together in one nation were still members of distinct ethnic groups, and he allowed each group to retain its own laws in local areas. To ensure justice, he saw to it that each group's laws were set down in writing and carefully enforced. In this, he has huge significance for today.
Today we're thinking about how is Europe going to live together, the European Union? And we're trying out different models. We're trying out a model of centralized power in which we all follow sort of a similar set of laws, a similar set of practices. And the alternative, of course, is to sort of have a loose conglomeration of powers and we all follow slightly different forms of law, but we get on, we cooperate. The interesting thing is that Charlemagne's vision of his empire, of the equivalent of Europe, was to allow people to follow quite different sets of laws depending on their local region, their traditions, and to have a kind of a loose umbrella of power that held that all together. That actually worked for Charlemagne. Later generations, his successors, Louis in particular, tried to enforce centralized power, and that didn't work. So perhaps there's a lesson for us to learn about Europe. Charlemagne's way of diversity and unity perhaps is the way forward.
Even today in his capital, Aachen, the Charlemagne Prize is awarded every year to somebody who is considered to have made a contribution to European unity. His reign and the years immediately after became known as the Carolingian Age, an age that has long been seen as one of the most decisive turning points in the history of Europe, both politically and socially. But how much do we really know about Charlemagne the man and what he was like?
We are quite lucky to have a description by a contemporary, by his friend Einhard. He said that Charlemagne was a real glorious, magnificent Christian king, surpassing every king of his time in his wisdom and his greatness of mind. But he also gave us a more private view of the king. He was telling us he was strong and tall, but not immoderately so. He had bright eyes, a nice face and beautiful grey hair, but he had also a small fat neck and a protruding belly, and also a falsetto voice. And Einhard told us as well that the king was very interested in sciences and the classical antiquity, and that he gathered lots of educated people at his court.
He was the eldest son of the Frankish leader Pipin the Short, who was a staunch ally of the Pope. From an early age, Charlemagne learned the arts of war when, during his father's reign, he accompanied the Frankish army on campaigns to defend the Pope against the Lombards, a Germanic people who controlled northern and central Italy, and on missions to conquer the region of Aquitaine in what is now southwestern France. These youthful experiences shaped his character and ambitions. He shared with his father an unbending will to power, a readiness to fight against his enemies and increase his domains, and the determination to be sole ruler, even if it meant denying his own relatives their own rights. He also learned at a very early age the importance of strong leadership on the battlefield and of close links between the power of the ruler and the church. His chance to put into practice what he had learned came early. In 768, when Charlemagne was 26, his father died, and in accordance with old Frankish custom, the kingdom was divided between Pipin's two sons. It wasn't long, though, before a strong rivalry sprang up between the brothers. It started with a revolt in Aquitaine, which Charlemagne marched to suppress with a large force. He invited his brother to join the campaign, but they argued immediately, and Carloman returned to Burgundy, leaving Charlemagne to continue alone in the reconquest of Aquitaine. The Frankish army fought through to the Bordeaux region and built a huge fortified camp at Fronsac on the banks of the Dordogne. Charlemagne was victorious in this, his very first campaign, making him indisputable king of Aquitaine. He divided the region up into countships, placing the command with men from north of the river Loire who were entirely his own. After the reconquest of Aquitaine, his mother, Bertha, tried to bring about a reconciliation with his brother. But Charlemagne was already demonstrating his political shrewdness by making treaties with his cousin Duke Tassilo of Bavaria and with the Lombard king Desiderius, both rulers whose territories bordered on those of Carloman. To cement the alliance with Lombardy, he married Desiderata, the daughter of Desiderius. But this was a purely political marriage, and it wasn't to last very long. And when Carloman died suddenly the next year, Charlemagne no longer needed the alliance and sent his wife back to her father in Pavia. Straight away, he married a Swabian noblewoman called Hildegard, and so got himself a new wife and the unrelenting hatred and opposition of his ex-father-in-law. With the death of his brother, Charlemagne made himself sole ruler of the entire Frankish kingdom, disinheriting Carloman's two young sons, who fled with their mother to the court of Desiderius at Pavia. It was the sort of ruthlessness that was to characterize his reign. Charlemagne now held all the Frankish territories, but he was determined to strengthen his realm and bring order to the whole of Europe. This was the start of a lengthy series of campaigns to expand his kingdom. Charlemagne's first move came against Saxony, a region in what is now northwestern Germany. This was a very unruly area, very difficult to control and to pin down because there wasn't one ruler you could make a pact with. For a long time, the Saxons had been harassing the Franks with raids on their borders. Charlemagne saw them as a serious threat, and he wanted to convert these pagan people to Christianity and integrate them into his own kingdom. Their subjugation was to take Charlemagne 30 bloody years.
And in the times of Charlemagne, a Saxon means every barbarian who lived east of the River Rhine and north of the River Lippe. What we think was here in this territory was many small tribal units who lived under their own leaders, who chose warlords whenever war was at hand, and who were pagans. That means worshipped gods, several gods, and were convinced of divine natural powers like holy groves, trees and springs.
Saxon worship of their pagan gods took place in a sacred grove and centered round the Irminsul, a huge ancient tree trunk which housed treasures of gold and silver that were offered as tributes to the gods. This religious sanctuary stood near Paderborn and was a spiritual or magical center for the widely scattered and nomadic Saxon tribes. In the summer of 772, Charlemagne led an army into Middle Saxony. And when he got to Paderborn, he destroyed the Irminsul. He moved so quickly that the Saxons had no time to defend the sacred grove or remove its treasures, which Charlemagne distributed amongst his men. The destruction of the Irminsul signaled to the world that Charlemagne would only allow Christianity to be practiced, and it earned for him the unfailing hatred and opposition of the Saxons. The resistance of this fierce nomadic people to Christian religion was to goad Charlemagne into committing the greatest crime of his life. On the other side of the mighty Alps, the Lombard king, Desiderius, had taken up arms against the Pope and conquered part of the papal lands. When he did, he attempted to force Pope Adrian I to recognize Carloman's sons as heirs to their father's kingdom, which Charlemagne had taken from them. As the defender of the papacy and of his own interests, Charlemagne couldn't stand by. He reconvened his fighting force in the spring of 773 and intervened. By this time, Charlemagne was establishing himself as a successful military leader. One of the reasons for his success was the fact that he knew how to manage his troops and get the best out of them by rewarding them with land, offices, and treasures. Regular pay was unheard of, so booty was the usual form of reward at the end of a successful campaign. But it wasn't just the promise of booty that made Charlemagne's army the most successful fighting force in Europe. He made military service a condition of owning property, so military morale was founded on the defense and extension of your own land. Every freeman at the call to arms had to report in full equipment to the local count. But the most crucial factor in his success was detailed advanced planning. In Charlemagne's day, warfare was determined by the seasons, and it was the military custom of the Franks to gather the army in spring and to remain active for 3 to 6 months. Soldiers had to take with them 3 months' supply of provisions, arms, armor, and tools. Herds of cattle and extensive baggage trains followed the troops with wine, food, clothes, and spare equipment.
I think to be a good military leader in the Middle Ages, you needed some obvious talents. You needed to be good at strategy. You needed to be a good tactician. You need to be able to control logistics. But more importantly than that, you needed to be a charismatic individual, someone who was in touch with your troops, someone who could enforce your will through power of personality. And in some ways, Charlemagne was a man of the people. He wasn't someone who set himself apart. He wasn't someone who tried to create sort of an idealized cult of personality, where he was a distant, very unknown quantity, even to his aristocrats around him. He was, to his nobility at least, he was quite a closely followed figure, and that made him someone who was quite an effective general.
Charlemagne tended to direct rather than fight battles, and his strategies were innovative and unusual. His favorite tactic was to divide his troops into 2 armies. One of these was led by himself or his son, and the other was generally led by someone he trusted, like an experienced nobleman. After confusing the opposition, the 2 armies would then meet in the chosen point of attack, combine their forces, and inflict a crushing defeat on the enemy. These were exactly the tactics he used in his Lombard campaign. His armies marched from Geneva, with Charlemagne leading one army himself over Mont Cenis, while his uncle Bernard led another through the Great St. Bernard Pass. Access to Lombardy had been fortified by Desiderius, with defenses in the Alpine gorges at Ivrea and Susa. But a band of Franks climbed over the mountains at Susa and outflanked the Lombards, forcing Desiderius to fall back on his capital, Pavia. Charlemagne quickly followed his advance band and laid siege to Pavia. As the siege dragged on, Charlemagne spent the spring of 774 in Rome, where he held meetings with the Pope, Hadrian I, confirming an alliance between them. By the summer of 774, Pavia was in a state of famine from the long siege, and Desiderius agreed to submit on condition that his life and those of his men would be spared. When Desiderius emerged from the walls, Charlemagne honored his word. The Lombard king was exiled and became a monk in the Abbey of Corbey, where he died in his old age. Back in the north of his lands, the Saxons had revolted against Frankish rule. This was to be repeated many times before he finally subdued them.
Saxony was not one political structure, one strong political structure, but many smaller tribal units. And whenever Charlemagne waged war against one of them and made peace with them and defeated the people, baptized the people, that meant nothing for the other tribal unit. And so they started, they kept on making war.
To gain the upper hand, Charlemagne had to repeatedly invade and conquer the Saxon lands and use drastic techniques of extermination and punishment. He transplanted entire tribes to break down any sense of identity, built towns, churches and castles wherever he could, and backed large numbers of Christian missionaries with force of arms. Many hostages were taken from the families of tribal chiefs, mainly young men who were held in monasteries in the Frankish lands. Charlemagne saw his campaign against the Saxons as a holy war. He believed that the sword must prepare the way for Christ and that heathens had to be converted for their own good. This gave him plenty to do because non-Christians surrounded his lands. To the southwest, his growing empire was bounded by the Pyrenees, beyond which lay one of the greatest threats to his Christian kingdom, the Moorish territories of Al-Andalus. Although the pagan Saxons were not fully subdued, from the year 777, Charlemagne turned his attention to the Moors. The Moors had overrun Spain at the beginning of the 8th century, bringing Islam with them. By the time of Charlemagne, Abd ar-Rahman, the Emir of Cordoba, controlled most of the country. But there were factions in the north of Spain who were not happy with this. So in the year 777, Suleiman, the governor of Barcelona, led an embassy to Paderborn, where Charlemagne was holding a grand assembly to impress the recently defeated Saxons. Suleiman declared that he would rather make a pact with the infidel than live under the rule of Abd ar-Rahman, and promised to turn over the cities he held to Charlemagne and use his own followers to capture the great fortress of Zaragoza. At this same assembly, it was confirmed that Saxony was now part of the Frankish kingdom. Many Saxons were baptized and swore oaths to remain loyal on threat of forfeiture of their lands and freedom. So Charlemagne, thinking that Saxony was now secured, accepted the offer from the Moors, which would push his frontier beyond the Pyrenees. In 778, he led a huge army into Spain, with half crossing the western Pyrenees and the other half taking an eastern route. The two Frankish forces joined together outside Zaragoza. But the Muslim uprisings that Suleiman had promised as part of the strategy failed to appear. Charlemagne saw that his unaided forces couldn't challenge the might of Cordoba. So he decided to return to Aquitaine, storming Pamplona and defeating the Basques on the way. But then disaster struck. When he was returning across the Pyrenees, the rear guard of his army, under his lieutenant Roland, was cut off and massacred by Basques. It was one of the biggest setbacks he ever had and the closest he came to a military defeat.
He himself was never defeated. Any campaign, expedition that he was involved in was successful. Where there are defeats, they're always involving his subordinates, either exceeding their orders or failing to take proper precautions, and usually when he himself wasn't present or in the vicinity. I say this particular campaign in Spain in 778 was the nearest that an army in which he himself was in command came to a disaster.
But before Charlemagne had time to recover from this setback, news reached him of yet another revolt in Saxony. It was led by a chieftain called Witikind. This was one Saxon leader who had never given in to Charlemagne, and he was to prove to be his most formidable adversary. Witikind returned from exile in Denmark, gathered a large Saxon army, and attacked a Carolingian fort, taking revenge for the destruction of the Irminsul. Churches were burned, and priests were put to death. So in the summer of 779, Charlemagne put together an army and went into Saxony again. The land was put to fire and the sword, and the Saxons were defeated once more, but Witikind managed to get away. Charlemagne withdrew to think about the best way to keep the Saxons under submission. In the spring of 780, he ordered a council or diet where he outlined a plan for the control of Saxony. The whole land was to be divided up into missionary territories, each one under the religious instruction of a group of Frankish monks. Many thousands of pagans were baptized.
Charlemagne was a Christian ruler. I mean, he had received, as it were, Christian inauguration. He was a baptized Christian. And there was a very strong tradition that, if you like, that the ruler had authority from God, and therefore the introduction of Christianity into new territories that he conquered was absolutely obligatory.
Religion clearly played an important part in Charlemagne's life, or at least it did when it suited him, because for such a religious man he was rather relaxed when it came to matters of sexual morality. With 4 wives and 5 known mistresses, and at least 18 children of whom only 8 were legitimate, the commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," was not one he took too seriously. His own activities perhaps go a little way to explain his relaxed attitude to his daughter's illegitimate children. Charlemagne was so devoted to his daughters that he told them they couldn't marry because he would be too lonely without them, so their secret affairs and children could be forgiven as long as they didn't leave him. But although he was a kind and a warm man with his family and friends, he could also be extremely ruthless, especially in his effort to spread Christianity. And in Saxony, these ruthless tactics seemed to be working. Between 780 and 782, Saxony seemed to be well under control. Even when Charlemagne left the country, no immediate rebellion occurred, and enforced missionary work seemed to be successful. A Saxon code of law was published which dealt firmly with reversions to paganism. And any return to the old way of worship was punishable by death.
They frequently capitulated and gave him hostages and also took oaths. But of course, while they were not Christians, those oaths were really meaningless. They could, if you like, say what they wanted. And they could take oaths on gospel books, on relics of saints, but if they weren't Christians, they can hardly have believed that any kind of sanction existed to back up the oaths that they'd taken. So, say, in a very practical way, it was necessary to impose, if you like, a common faith, so that agreements like those made with the various groups of Saxons could really be made to work.
In response to all this militant Christianity, Wittekind returned from his refuge in pagan Denmark in 782 and summoned the northern tribes to revolt. Churches were burnt, priests killed, and Saxons ritually washed off their enforced baptism. Charlemagne decided that severe punishment was needed. On his command, the most active rebel leaders and warriors were brought as captives to Charlemagne. Altogether, 4,500 men were bound and taken to a camp at Verden on the river Aller, where Charlemagne ordered the beheading of the entire company. Between 783 and 785, there was continual conflict across Saxony. Charlemagne swept through the lands twice with his armies, burning and killing wherever he could find victims, but the Saxons held out in the impenetrable forests and marshes.
By this stage, he's resorting to some fairly savage methods, I mean, including deportation. There's almost, if you like, an ethnic cleansing of Saxons east of the Elbe. in the final stages of the conquest.
In the end, this ruthlessness paid off as the Saxon resistance was worn down. In 785, Wittikind asked for a peace settlement and was given his life in exchange for his surrender and baptism. Once Wittikind and his warriors gave in, the revolt began to collapse. At last, his longest-standing enemy was defeated, and like Desiderius before him, Wittikind was shown clemency. In fact, Charlemagne was so overjoyed by his conversion that he heaped gifts on him and confirmed him in his possessions in Saxony. Although there were 4 more uprisings between 792 and 804, Saxony was well under control by this time, and given the tie-up between the power of the state and the Christian faith, this meant all the Saxons had to be converted.
At the very least, he's using the Christian message alongside his territorial ambitions. I mean, one of the things that's unusual about Charlemagne, one of the things that marks him out for history, is that he creates a new vision of kingship. And that is that after him, kings become what we call sacral. The technical term sacral really means that they are sacred figures. Not only are they political figures, not only are they military figures, but they have a role to play in the church and over the control and dissemination of Christianity. Now, he's very keen to push himself as a spiritual figure, as a sacral figure. And that means he has obligations. He has to, spread Christianity to new areas when he's conquering them. He has to control bishops. He has to control the ecclesiastical framework of the world around him. It brings responsibilities, but it also brings him power. Of course, that sacrality is his hallmark, really, as an emperor and as a king.
With Saxony subdued, Charlemagne turned his attention to Bavaria, where he deposed his cousin Tassilo III. The Duke, who had been frequently rebellious, was exiled to the monastery of Jumièges, and Charlemagne brought under his control the last of the German tribes beyond the Rhine. With his conquest of the Saxons and his annexation of Bavaria, Charlemagne brought all the Germanic tribes together in one political unit. Now he needed to turn his attention to regions bordering on his extensive empire. The period between 785 and 814 saw the second stage of his expansion and conquests, during which time he came into conflict with the Avars in the southeast and the Saracens in the southwest. The Avars were a nomadic Tatar people who occupied territories along Charlemagne's borders on the Danube. In 788, they invaded his lands in Lombardy. So Charlemagne himself led an army down the Danube and laid waste to Avar territories. But he was called away to deal with yet another revolt in Saxony. His son, Pipin, carried on with the Avar campaign. He captured their royal camp, forced them to surrender, and sent great booty to Aachen. Charlemagne was at his magnificent new palace when the treasure arrived, 15 wagon loads of it. He and all his court were awestruck at the sight of great heaps of gold coins, jeweled swords, and gold and silver ornaments. And like a Roman emperor, he distributed the treasure lavishly, rewarding generously all who had served him. And God, who had served him best of all, came first. But Charlemagne's campaigns were not yet over, and the climax of his reign was still to come. By now, though, he was able to spend more of his time at his court while he sent one of his sons out to do battle. The campaigns against the Moors were led by another of Charlemagne's sons, Louis, who had been made king of Aquitaine by his father. Louis pushed deep into Moorish territory, and fearing that he might not be able to halt the Frankish advance, the Umayyad ruler in Cordoba, Al-Hakem, sought terms with Charlemagne and ceded territories along the Spanish side of the Pyrenees. These territories became the March of Spain, which in later years became the Kingdom of Aragon, and acted as an important buffer against Moorish invasions into the rest of Europe. By now, Charlemagne's campaigns had been going on for over a quarter of a century. The thing that enabled him to hold on to all the gains that he had made over this time and keep control over a rapidly expanding empire was his ability as an administrator. Throughout his lands, Charlemagne granted large landholdings called fiefs to local nobles and tribal military leaders in exchange for their loyalty, and he appointed Frankish aristocrats to the posts of counts or governors of a district which was called a county. Each political district had its parallel in a church district or diocese, headed by a bishop with similar authority in all matters related to the church. Every year, both counts and bishops attended a general assembly at Charlemagne's court, where they would advise the emperor and hear his directives. Charlemagne also reorganized the economy of his empire. In order to improve trade and commerce, he standardized tolls and customs dues as well as weights and measures. He constructed roads and bridges and even attempted the massive engineering feat of digging a canal between the Rhine and the Danube. He instituted important judicial and legal reforms and ordered the compilation and codification of the laws of many of the tribes he had conquered.
In terms of the way Europe ran, he was very, very efficient in comparison to his predecessors. Now, with most medieval leaders, there's something to learn about efficient rulers. Basically, if you want to get as much as you can out of the world around you, i.e. to gain as much money from it, as much clear support, you need to be quite efficient at running it. So those that are strong leaders, those that are quite exploitative leaders, tend to be the ones that are most efficient as well. That's very true of Charlemagne. He was very keen to make his will felt around Europe. So he was keen to send out envoys, what we call missi, on a very regular basis. He was keen to make his proclamations known in documents.
Just as important was the cultural revival he instituted, which became known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne ordered bishops and abbots to set up schools for the training of monks and other clerics. Charlemagne also persuaded Alcuin of York and other leading scholars of the day to come to his court and establish a new library of pagan and Christian works. Soon the palace school became an active center of learning. Much of his motivation for this policy was practical as well as religious. Because the training was conducted in Latin, it promoted the standardization of a common written and spoken language in a huge empire which had many different languages and dialects.
So what is really an achievement of Charlemagne is that he managed to transfer the ideas, the culture of late antiquity, of Christian late antiquity, up to the Middle Ages, and that affected every part of culture, the literature, the sciences, and the law. He did reforms in every aspect of cultural life, and that's his one big achievement.
Knowledge was all important to Charlemagne, so he became the most eager student of all. At a time when the only men of learning were the monks, here was a leader who was an intellectual and theologian, a ruler who changed the face of Europe both politically and culturally. Even during times of fighting, he continued to create centers for the arts to flourish, encouraging architecture, manuscript copying, bookbinding, and gold and silversmith work. He built schools and he laid down strict rules for teachers and students.
I think perhaps his biggest legacy that we can feel now is related to what we call the Carolingian Renaissance. After the fall of the Roman Empire, there'd been really quite a marked decline in interests in learning, in philosophy, in all sorts of forms of classical knowledge that had existed. Charlemagne's career really marked a bit of a turning point in that process. We don't see a complete rise in learning, and we don't see a permanent rise in an interest in things like philosophy, but we see enough of a sort of a burst of interest, enough of a burst of copying texts and preserving texts from the classical world that they survive into the later modern period, into the later medieval period and into the early modern period. And that means that we can now look back on classical antiquity in a much clearer way because of Charlemagne's position. That influences the growth of science in the early modern era, that influences all our ideas about politics and society that come from the classical world. Without Charlemagne, we may not even know some of these texts that have survived and influenced us so powerfully.
But the only lasting literary work of the age was the brief and simple biography of Charlemagne by his secretary, Einhard. Einhard was a man of many talents. Charlemagne made him a royal steward and treasurer, and he chose him to supervise, perhaps even design, much of the architecture of this creative reign. Although there is very little of them left now, palaces were built for the emperor at Ingelheim, Nijmegen, and at Aachen. This is all that is left of the palace at Nijmegen. His favorite residence was here at Aachen, and in 794, after 26 years of almost constant campaigning, he established it as the main seat of his court. The choice was made partly for strategic reasons, but also because of the presence of hot springs here. His palace stood on the site of the city's 14th century town hall, and part of it can still be seen in this tower, making it, probably, the oldest example in the world of a municipal building that has been in continual use. The church he built here was one of the greatest of the age. Workmen were recruited from all parts of his kingdom to build it. It was octagonal in shape and modelled on the Byzantine church of San Vitale in Ravenna. Pope Hadrian gave Charlemagne mosaics and marbles from Roman Ravenna, while Charlemagne himself lavished gold and silver on its decoration and provided doors of solid brass. It was this devotion to the cause of Christendom and his close alliance with the Pope that led to the great climax of Charlemagne's reign, his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor. In 799, Pope Leo III was threatened by a rebellion in Rome, and he took refuge with Charlemagne at Paderborn. Charlemagne had Leo escorted back to Rome, and in November 800 joined him there, where he was received with imperial honors. Leo's enemies were executed or imprisoned, and after a ceremonial oath-taking, he was reinstated as Pope. Then, during Christmas Mass in St. Peter's, the Pope suddenly produced a jeweled crown and placed it on Charlemagne's head, crowning him Emperor of the West. Charlemagne is said to have been surprised by the coronation, declaring that he would not have come into church if he had known of the Pope's plan. But was he happy to be crowned emperor?
The ultimate question. We have all sorts of different versions of what happened. Some even give us the image that he was there in Rome on Christmas Day 800 and literally was standing up from the ceremony that was taking place and suddenly found the crown on his head, sort of completely surprised, unaware. And in some ways that's the line that we hear from the Carolingian sources, from people who are writing about the history the way he wanted it. My own view of the reality, as close as we can get to it, is that he was complicit in the coronation, at least, that he knew what was going to happen and that he was happy to be crowned king and become emperor. The problem came when he really realized what that meant. It meant two things. It meant he was going to be very, very closely tied to the person who had made him emperor, that is the Pope. He effectively was going to be a permanent ally of the Pope and going to have responsibilities for the Pope. The second problem is he suddenly realized that being made an emperor by someone else puts you in a position of subservience. Instead of being the most powerful man on earth with political power and, crucially, spiritual power, he went to being someone who was created by the Pope, that is, underneath the Pope. So there's a huge tension created by that one moment, the coronation in 800. That creates a tension that lasts for centuries to come. Who's more powerful, an emperor or a pope?
After his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor, the urge to go to battle became less pressing. But the size of the empire he had created began to cause problems. Charlemagne had tried to protect Francia from the Saxons by taking the Saxon lands into Frankish civilization. But now the united Germany that had been created had to be protected from the Vikings. By 800 they had established a kingdom in Jutland and were raiding the Frisian coast. Charlemagne had to build fleets and forts on shores and rivers, and he stationed garrisons at danger points. But realizing that his far-flung empire needed quick defense at many points at once, he divided it in 806 among his 3 sons, Pipin, Louis, and Charles. But Pipin died in 810 and Charles in 811. Only the gentle Louis, the least fitted of the 3 to hold the empire together, remained. Nevertheless, in 813, Louis was elevated from the rank of king to that of emperor by his father. 4 months later, wintering in Aachen, the old monarch was seized with a high fever and developed pleurisy. He tried to cure himself by taking only liquids, but after an illness of 7 days, he died in the 47th year of his reign and the 72nd year of his life. He was buried under the dome of his cathedral at Aachen. Soon, all the world called him Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, which soon became Charlemagne. Throughout the Middle Ages and into modern times, he has been the model of the ideal warrior king and the inspiration for all empire builders in Europe.